Good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 Online Economic History Workshop. Today we have the Wartime Production Panel. I'm Frank Garman at Christopher Newport University, and we're joined here with two presenters, Casey Pender, who will be presenting his paper with Vincent Geloso on the myth of wartime prosperity, evidence from the Canadian experience, and Alexander Field from Santa Clara University and his paper on the decline of US manufacturing productivity between 1941 and 1948. After both panelists have a chance to present their papers, Aaron Honsowetz from Bethany College is going to reflect briefly on both presentations, and we will finish the session with panelists responding to questions from Aaron and from you, the audience. You can submit questions for consideration by posting them to Twitter with the hashtag OEHW2022 or by submitting them on YouTube. I recommend submitting questions as soon as you think of them so that we have time to read through them before the start of the Q&A session. And remember that all works that you're seeing here today are works in progress. Your questions and feedback can help the presenters to improve their research. And we now begin the Wartime Production Panel with Casey Pender's presentation of the myth of wartime prosperity, Canadian evidence.
Okay, thanks, Frank. My screen sharing working out all right? Okay. Yeah, well, great. Well, thanks for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction. So this is a working paper that is joint research with Vincent Geloso, who's a professor at George Mason University. I'm Casey Pender. I'm a doctoral candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And the working title of our paper right now is "The Myth of Wartime Prosperity: Evidence from the Canadian Experience." So the idea for this research is basically just to take some insights that have been already put forward in the U.S. experience, analyzing how things like GDP and other output measures can be utilized during wartime. There's a pretty large body of research that has a lot of history, including Professor Field, who's actually here today. But we think there's room to add this to the Canadian experience because relatively little has been done up north here. And the sort of the key insight, at least the way we interpret it, the way we're taking from this literature, is that to the extent you can use something like output, real output, like work I'm calling Y here, as a function of social welfare or prosperity, at least two conditions should be met. Markets should be at least reasonably competitive, and that should be where prices are determined, and households should be free to make consumption and leisure decisions. And of course, even under these circumstances, real output is still just an approximation. Approximately, still lots of issues, especially when you look at the distribution of things. Right, we're only getting a mean here, but nonetheless, it should at least give us a picture, of what's being bought and sold in the market, which should represent, people making choices that they feel are best for them. The problem being is that during wartime, these conditions clearly break down. So, production begins to take place outside of the market. When there's price controls, prices are no longer determined on the market. And when there's things like conscription and rationing, households are no longer free to make choices. And so whatever these metrics are showing us, the link towards social welfare, or if we want to call it prosperity, starts to break down. And so when we're looking at things like GDP or GNP, we have to grapple with these issues when we're looking at periods of war, and we at least feel the literature hasn't done this to the full extent in Canada. Now, why should we care about studying Canada at all? Well, for a couple of reasons. So one being, it's pretty clear, at least seems clear to me, that you're not going to find wartime prosperity arguments, the idea that wartime spending can bring on a prosperous economy when the war is taking place on your soil, right? When there's fighting going on in domestic borders, it's pretty unlikely to see arguments that the war is a good thing. But when the government spending is contributing to a war overseas, you start to see these arguments arise. So you see this not only in the United States, but also in Canada. So, there's only a handful of countries that sort of fit this bill. And so by studying Canada, it gives us some extra data points beyond just the US experience. And additionally, because Canada is so heavily tied to Britain, particularly in World War I and World War II, it's involved in both wars longer. So we actually have longer periods of study in Canada and in the US. And second, despite maybe some of these arguments that I mentioned in the previous ones, particularly say arguments from Higgs, being now 30 years old, you still see some of these notions or ideas getting propagated forward in Canada today in universities. So, for example, in the Canadian economic history textbook that's taught at my university at Carleton, you still see this idea that the war, World War II, ended the Great Depression, right? So this idea that the government spending was able to bring about prosperity and the depression. And so we still see these sort of myths persisting, and we also have a long period of study to analyze. And so that's why we're going to look at Canada in particular. And what we're going to do here, or at least what we plan to do here so far, is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's basically just applying some methods from some of Higgs's earlier papers to Canada. And so admittedly, this is overly simple, perhaps overly simplified, but we think it's at least a good first step in starting to take this stuff seriously in the Canadian experience. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take measures of output and adjust them by removing military spending. The idea is that military spending is on things that aren't leading to consumption or enjoyment by households. And so if we want to use output as a measure of utility or of welfare, then these things need to be removed, right? And that follows largely from the arguments of Higgs 92. Next, we're going to use a regression to estimate price levels, specifically in World War II, because as I'll discuss in a minute, that's when we have pretty heavy price controls. And so using traditional deflators isn't going to give us a very accurate representation of real GDP. And then finally, we're looking at DPI, or domestic private investment, and looking at those trends in light of what we see in the GDP data. So just jumping into the real GDP per capita. So for now, this is the GDP deflated by traditional methods before we get into our own price deflator. And you see when you remove military outlays, there's quite a bit of difference in both wars, especially even more dramatic in World War II than in World War I. And I can just zoom in here on the two wars just to see, get a bit of a closer picture of what's going on. So we see in the World War I context, the pre-war high of real GDP per capita is in 1913, and when GDP is unadjusted, that high gets broken for three of the years of the war through 1916 through 1918. Sorry, but when it's adjusted, it actually never hits that high again. It stays below the pre-war highs, and is about 10% lower than when methods are unadjusted. Metrics are unadjusted, sorry. Now, again, things become even more dramatic when we look to World War II. So just pulling back here again, because I didn't include it in this closer graph, where you can see the instead of looking at the pre-war high, I think it's relevant here to look at the pre-depression high, whether or not wartime spending got Canada out of the Great Depression. So the pre-depression high for GDP per capita is in 1928. In terms of the unadjusted metrics, that quickly gets broken in 1940. So here we're already above of the pre-depression highs, and then it takes off to be quite a bit higher than the Great Depression very quickly. But when we take away the military spending, growth is much slower, just barely hitting the pre-depression highs in 1942, but then actually we see declines in non-war output in 43 and 44. So this serious dip. And in terms of the most extreme case here, in 1943, we actually see a 48% decline relative to the adjusted numbers. And so, again, just worth thinking about what we're doing here, because on one sense, of course, if you think of GDP as sort of a giant pile of goods and you remove some of those goods, it's going to be self-evidently true that the number is going to be lower. And so, perhaps this is no surprise that the numbers are lower, but it's worth thinking about, what we're excluding and what we're leaving in and what this is telling us, right? So we're arguing that, within the basket of goods that are remaining, these are a basket of goods that are a better picture of what people are actually able to consume and enjoy in the households in Canada. And we see, again, when you start taking away tanks and guns, these things are actually declining in the midst of World War II and are at least much lower in World War I. Now, again, in World War II specifically, so World War I had price controls in Canada, but the federal government at the time was quite a bit smaller and wasn't able to well enforce them. And so sort of de facto prices were still able to freely move. In World War II, the price controls were much more strict and much more well enforced. And so what we see is a sort of a wide blanket of price ceilings on practically all commodities and services, including including all public utilities, all sorts of things like beauty parlors, picture shows, morticians, and so forth. So basically the entire market has price controls. And so arguably when you're deflating a nominal GDP series by a deflator with price controls in it, right, you're not getting an accurate picture of what's going on. And so we're taking a method from Vetter and Galloway, which is just a simple regression to sort of track what prices would be given that we have price controls. Now, Vetter and Galloway include a term for employment in their regression. Unfortunately, we don't have one of the frustrating things about doing historical work for Canada is we often don't have the data that's available for the US, and so we're not able to get, at least we haven't been able to find yet a good employment series to use for regression. And so admittedly, this is somewhat suggestive, but I think it's at least a step at getting at what prices could have been had prices been free to move. So we're going to regress against the money supply, the interest rate on commercial paper, and freight hauled by rail. And when we do this, we see that inflation would have been actually quite a bit higher, again through World War II. So which means that real GDP, when deflated by this series, is actually even lower. And so again, we see this big dip towards 43. If you take our now deflated series absent war compared to the original unadjusted series, you now see a 62% decline in real GDP through in the most extreme part, which is 1943. Now, even if you don't buy our arguments about removing military outlays, when you use this deflator and instead of the price controlled deflator, you still see quite a significant decline in real GDP growth through the midst of World War II. Now, again, this may be somewhat suggestive, but we also argue that domestic private investment should give us a fairly good indicator of prosperity. The argument being is that when the future looks bright, when people either believe that this is a prosperous times are to come, investment in private businesses within the country should be rising, and conversely, when things are looking pretty glum and gloomy, you're going to see investment falling. And that's exactly what we see when we look at domestic private investment trends in Canada. So looking over the two wars, you see quite a big dip in domestic private investment in World War I. And in World War II, we do see some increases, but these are increasing trends that seem to be going on from the depths of the Depression from 33 onwards. And it seems like the trend upward is somewhat declined by the time we get into the midst of World War II. And so just another way to think about this is looking at it as a ratio of GNP. So again, we can look at it as a ratio of GNP with our adjusted series, so that's absent wartime, or with the total series. Now, of course, again, adding a larger denominator is going to make these investment numbers look worse. But even when we look at private investment as a fraction of the adjusted GNP series, so that's the series where when wartime spending is removed, we still see this large decline in the ratio of DPI in World War I, and then again in World War II, we see that while there is this slight decline, we see this big dip again in 1943, and we don't see investment coming to pre-depression levels until after the wars ended. And so in 1946 is when investment levels hit the pre-depression highs. And so again, we think this at least sort of fits with the story. We see this dip in 43 in both investment and war adjusted GNP that is absent when you look at the unadjusted series. So if we go back here, right, it looks like you see this large increase in GNP, but That's mostly just driven by military outlays. And so just to wrap up what we're trying to do here, just to be clear, we're not saying that military expenditures can't have any value, right? There might be good moral reasons to fight a war. The idea is that doing what's morally right may not come with a silver lining, right? It may come with an absolute cost. And so what we're arguing is when we want to start thinking about how prosperous things were in Canada, especially say looking at the Great Depression and when that ended, we can't just use unadjusted GNP without thinking about what its components parts are, because of this idea that welfare and prosperity is only linked to present and future consumption of final goods and services when we don't include things like tanks. And so when we account for this in Canada, at least our sort of preliminary evidence seems to suggest that Canadians were far less prosperous than average during wartime than what we would initially see. So that's sort of our what we're trying to get at with this paper anyway. So looking forward to the end if anyone has any comments or ideas on how to make this research better. But thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thank you, Casey. We now turn to Alexander Field and his paper on the decline of U.S. manufacturing productivity between 1941 and 1948. You're muted.
Okay, yes, well, thank you, Frank, and thank you, Aaron, for all the work setting this up. Let me try to share my screen with the slideshow here. Hold on, slideshow. Okay, everybody can see the screen now? Just get the heads up, that's great. Okay, well, again, thanks very much, Casey and Vincent, for the paper and the research you're doing in the presentation. As I was listening to it, I was just jotting down some thoughts, and here's one way in which to compare and contrast these two presentations. It seems to me that Casey and Vincent are largely concerned with myths about production. I'm less concerned with myths about production and more concerned with myths about productivity and the contribution of the Second World War in the United States to long-term productivity growth and the growth of potential output. So in 2011, I published A Great Leap Forward, Yale University Press, which argued that behind the backdrop of double-digit unemployment, the Depression years were in the United States extraordinarily technologically progressive, and as a consequence, potential output grew rapidly between 29 and 41. Now, in that book and earlier papers, I also laid out a closely related thesis, which is the starting point for this work, and that was that the supply foundations for the golden age of U.S. economic growth, generally understood to be 1948 to 1973, were already in place in 1941. And indeed, it was the growth of potential output across the Depression years that lay behind U.S. Success in prosecuting the war, serving as an arsenal of democracy, both for our own troops and for those of our allies, including Britain and the Soviet Union. And so this paper builds on research that I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. It's also recently published by Yale about a month and a half ago. So let me just start by talking about the conventional, what I see as the conventional economic analysis of the war from the standpoint of the United States. And as I see it, it emphasizes 3 principal themes. First, that the massive fiscal and monetary stimulus associated with mobilization did, in fact, at least in the U.S., close the negative output gap still prevailing in December 41. In terms of the work that Casey and Vincent are involved with, some of my different perspectives on this may have to do with the size of the output gap that I still see remaining in 1941. Second, and closely related, there's consensus in the U.S. that the U.S. did succeed in producing an enormous amount of ordnance and indeed total output between 41 and 45. I'm less concerned with the welfare implications during the war than in the first paper presented here. But the third theme concerns the longer run consequences of learning by doing, making military durables. Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships assembled in Richmond, California, and elsewhere, and Henry Ford's B-24 plant in Willow Run, 30 miles from Detroit often figure prominently in these narratives, but they are by no means the only examples adduced. And the claim, which you see over and over again in the literature, both in economics and economic history and among historians, is that learning as the result of production experience accumulated resulted in big increases in industrial productivity across the war years, with persisting benefits that helped lay the supply side foundations for the golden age of U.S. economic growth. Now, from my perspective, the first two of these conclusions are largely indisputable. But here's the problem. The third one can't be correct if the argument that I advanced earlier, that the supply foundations for the golden age were already in place in 1941, is right. Now, I think that the proposition that I'm setting up, I'm persuaded that it's not a straw man, and in the paper and in earlier work, I've gone to considerable lengths to document this. I don't have time today to go through this, but I will simply say that the idea that war leaves a beneficial supply side legacy for an economy has, in my opinion, flourished in interpretations of the effects of U.S. participation in the Second World War. I don't know if you see the same thing in Canada. It might be interesting to explore that. So I'll just give you one example. Most of you are probably familiar with the economic journalist William Greider's book Secrets of the Temple back in '87, where he talked about how the Fed controlled the economy. And he described the economic consequences of World War II as, quote, extraordinarily bountiful, emphasizing how the government force-fed the rapid development of new productive facilities across many industrial sectors that would become the basic industries of America's post-war prosperity, thus laying the foundation, the groundwork for an abundant future. Now, again, I don't have time, but simply let me put it on the table that in the paper you'll find documentation of very similar propositions in the work of the distinguished British historian Alan Milward, in the work of Vernon Rutten, William Beaumont, famous economist, Bob Gordon, and among historians I talk about the work of Maury Klein, James Sparrow, and Arthur Herman. So let me skip through all of it, because again, just in the interest of time, but here's the point. If the thesis, and I also should emphasize that whereas Casey and Vincent's paper is, I think, dealing with total economy, I'm principally interested in this paper in manufacturing. And the reason for this is if the thesis that war benefits aggregate supply is right, it's within manufacturing that we should most likely see efficiency gains from the experience of economic mobilization. And the reason is that mechanized conflict required huge increases in the production of airplanes, tanks, ships, and many other types of ordnance, and the plant equipment, materials, energy, and intermediate goods necessary to make and, where applicable, operate them. And that, in turn, was associated with a big increase in the share of the civilian labor force devoted to manufacturing in the U.S. I suspect it was true in Canada as well. And within manufacturing, of course, and this we've also seen this in Canada, the share of output consisting of military goods. It's the manufacturing sector that is the locus of all the well-known learning by doing narratives. You can go back to the work of Ken Arrow and Armand Alchian back in the early 1960s, but the examples used are the famous Liberty ships, the destroyer escorts built in Maine, the C-47s, the B-24s, the Oerlikon and Bofors anti-aircraft guns, etc., etc. And these narratives emphasize and imply that the experience producing these goods generated sharp and persisting increases in efficiency that persisting in the sense that they moved the sector to permanently higher productivity levels, and thus essentially provided the supply side foundations for the post-war period. In fact, as this paper tries to document, the total factor productivity within manufacturing dropped. In fact, it declined sharply during the war. It did improve somewhat after in 45 to 48, but overall there's a very significant decline. Now, what the paper does, and again, I have very limited time here, what the paper does basically is presents two bodies of evidence. It's the quantitative evidence that I'll describe here, and then there's a considerable degree of narrative evidence, which I think is consistent with it. I don't intend either of these bodies of evidence by themselves to be dispositive, but I think my TFP estimates kind of, I think, soften people up to at least be receptive to the arguments about why manufacturing declined so much during the war and why we have been misled over and over again by the learning by doing evidence, which I'm not disputing in any way. So here is my basic view of manufacturing growth over a century in the United States. We're measuring where possible from peak to peak. You, of course, see the incredible and never to be experienced again record of the 1920s. Over 5% a year for a decade, largely driven by the electrification of the internal distribution of power within factories, away from the mechanical shafts that were the signature of the late 19th century power-driven factory, to the one-story buildings, the electric wiring, the big decline in the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity, combined with innovations in fractional horsepower. Motors, electric motors. Devines talked about that. I've talked about that in other papers, and that's pretty much, kind of accepted, Kendrick and everybody else, and so on. What you see in the Depression years, this is essentially the earlier book that I did, at least with respect to manufacturing sector, is TFP growth that would be world-class by any standard of comparison other than the 1920s. And now my calculations suggest, in fact, TFP dropped dramatically between 1941 and 1945, again recovering a little bit between 45 and 48, but by no means enough to bring it back to the level it had in 1941. Again, coming back to the argument that the U.S. had opened up a very substantial productivity lead with Europe and the rest of the world by 1941. That's one of the reasons potential output was so much higher than everybody thought it was, because it's disguised by the double-digit unemployment. For a decade, it's not until Kuznets racks up the numbers that the military realizes how much can be produced, and then there has to be this rearguard action to stop them from doubling and tripling their demands for ordnance. So then, of course, you have 49 to 73, which is respectable, but one of the points I will make is that it's actually relatively anemic compared to what you've seen during the interwar period. 73 to 89 with the oil shocks and so on, it's down. You see the IT boom in 89 to 2008, and then we're back into negative territory. So again, taking a very long view, I will make the very provocative claim that the experience of military production during the Second World War can be seen both as the end of the beginning of world economic dominance by the United States in manufacturing, and in fact, if I can be pessimistic, the beginning of the end. So that's a provocative statement. I'm not trying to kind of defend all of that right now, but I'll put that on the table. All right, so let me just make a couple of remarks about this is basically kind of a standard canonical approach to growth accounting. In order to make these estimates, you need estimates on output growth, labor hours, and the growth in capital services. Output growth is basically value added in durables and non-durables from the 1966 edition of National Income and Products Accounts, deflated by the respective sectoral deflators in that same source. Growth in labor hours is FTEs in manufacturing, growth plus the growth of average weekly hours in the sector. Growth in capital services is more complicated. I'll just describe that briefly here. So what I do there is I start with data from the BEA's fixed asset table, chain type quantity indices for the net stock of private fixed assets. I then essentially augment them based on Gordon's numbers for the government-owned capital during the war. So these are the rates that I come down. That's pretty much what underlies the calculations. I think I only have a couple of minutes left, but these are my basic numbers. I'm sure some of this will come up in the questions. I do want to just take a quick look at some of the year-to-year changes within the war itself. So you see, first of all, between 39 and 41, very substantial increases in TFP. You have essentially a strong Depression era secular growth rate overlaid on a predictable cyclical effect. But then you see in the chaos of war mobilization, you see it dropping. In 43, you do begin to see some of the effects of learning by doing. But again, 44, there's a secondary product mix effect. I'll skip over the discussion of sensitivity biases and so on. And I'll just try to end up here by giving you a little bit of a preview in terms of the narrative that I'm advancing as to explain, make plausible what will otherwise be perceived as rather surprising, given everybody's kind of priors on this, declines in TFP during the war. Number one, it's the sudden radical change in output mix, the need to essentially shut down factories, rip out all the old machine tools, and essentially try to learn new techniques. It's always chaotic. When the automobile industry has its annual model change, you have essentially 1 or 2 weeks where output drops to zero. Of course, then productivity drops rather dramatically as a consequence. You have the chaotic scheduling and sequencing of production, which was marked by shortages of raw materials, components, and subassemblies, and particularly after the second half of 1943, nationwide shortage of labor. What was called priorities unemployment, idle labor and or capital due to the inability to obtain complementary inputs, which were being rationed, which was augmented by hoarding, essentially, as firms tried to be able to keep going. Competitive expediting enormous amount of times directed to trying to accelerating input deliveries. And finally, the negative supply shocks attributable to enemy action, which have been essentially largely forgotten. That was one of the main conclusions I reached in some of my research. Alan Millward, for example, says that our U.S. enemies never had any active interference, experience any active interference by the Axis powers on the workings of the U.S. economy. Contrasting that, of course, with the actually bombing of facilities in Britain or the United States. And I think that's true. The U.S. avoided any serious destruction outside of the island of Oahu in Hawaii. But at the same time, it's not true that Germany and Japan didn't have any effect. The role of rubber, the rubber shortage, this was one strategic material. We had basically nothing. I spend a considerable amount of time on that. And also the 400 ships torpedoed in 5 months by the Germans in the War of the Atlantic dramatically disrupted petroleum deliveries to the Eastern Seaboard. Aaron, I've run out of time here, I think, so I will stop here and let you probe with additional questions as we go into the Q&A, as well as other people who may be listening. But again, if you want a broader perspective, not everything that's in the paper is in the book, but again, the book is available, and I recommend it to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We now turn to Aaron Honsowetz to give comments and questions for our panelists.
So, I feel really good about your work in terms of measuring consumption declines for the myth of wartime prosperity in Canada. What I want to ask is what about after the war? And I'd say especially after looking at Alex's paper, if we're seeing this decline in productivity and manufacturing, why are we seeing such a rebound after the war? And it might be because we're about services versus manufacturing goods, possible. But the reason I'm also asking that question is that critics are going to ask the same question with this idea that you're pushing against a narrative that wartime economies generate good outcomes. And you're providing good evidence that, right now in the war, I'm having trouble getting eggs. But it is still possible that they're going to say, well, sure, you're having trouble getting eggs now, but this wonderful war, not sort of death and destruction, but economically, still is what enables us, when the war is over, that the economy is all great again. And so what I'm afraid might happen, though this still could be seen as progress, is in response to your paper, there's going to alter the narrative a little bit versus really ask, did the war hurt consumption? So they're just going to move their goalposts from being during the wartime period to being right after the war ends. And so I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are going to be about that. The other thing I want you to think about and address, and I know it might seem idiotic to say this, but someone's going to say it. They're going to look at your DPI relative to GNP numbers, and they're going to say, oh, great, look at this wonderful rate of return on my investment. As if I'm reading this correctly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you're looking at the total amount of private investment going to the economy. And you're dividing it by the GNP, whether you're looking at the adjusted or the unadjusted. And you're going to see that it, one way that number dips is that GNP gets a lot bigger. Well, is that because we're doing really well for our investment, that suddenly that our investment is now bringing us all this money? So I think that's something that looking at a few quick numbers, you can easily nip that argument. But I do think you have to address it because someone somewhere's going to bring it up, and it won't just be me. Oh, Alex, I do not envy your task because you're doing a total factor production. And the thing that always bothers me when doing total factor production is that it's a residual. And because it's a residual, there's so many different things that it can actually be. We have all these good guesses of what it could be, but we don't have definitive determination. And so are we really talking about, and I'm glad you're highlighting all these different things. I mean, this is the reason why you have to do that. We mentioned political interference. Political interference is not just about favoritism, but it's also mismanagement. And it's also creating weird incentives, right? One thing that I like to think about, it's a lovely book on the history of Michigan copper industry. During World War II, Michigan copper gets an extra subsidy to their price that isn't applied to copper produced anywhere else in the country. Was that really the right thing to do if we're pushing for copper production to increase? Why are we paying this money to Michigan copper and not just increasing the price in general? We're facing this whole tension between a war-managed economy through price boards versus one where we're relying more on the market system to help us. And so, you're taking on all these things that during the war that are interfering with the market, handling all the minimum market productivity of the workers. There's human capital depreciation. But the thing that really interests me about your paper is that it has this change in total factor productivity after the war. And we don't know, right? We don't know for sure if that rate of growth changes because of the war, right? You're doing a good job providing preponderance of evidence that it might be, or it might not be. But that unknown is there. The best evidence you have on that topic you cite is on the change in meaningful patterns. Because what I'm really curious to know is, does this decline in productivity, we're not getting this learning benefit from the war, potentially, is that the story that drives the lower total factor production growth rate afterwards? People can still argue that, look, that's still a great growth rate in historical terms. And they could still argue that without the war, that number could be worse. They can still argue that. You've done a good job providing the evidence to say, well, that might not be the case. But right now, because we're doing total factor productivity, your best evidence right now is looking at the meaningful research. But there's other factors in productivity, like the implementation of capital. Now, one of the big things that happens during the war in terms of implementing new technology is like in the railroads. The railroads' dieselization is slowed down by the war. There's limited access to using diesel technology, which means you're training workers to use tech that's going to go out of style because it's not as efficient. But then maybe we've created a path dependency that's leading to the longer use of old tech after the war because of the transition cost of the workers. And so what I'm looking for more is potential stories of what's taking place in that war period that's leading to spillover effects afterwards that would change the rate of total factor productivity over time. That would be why we're going from, an outstanding phenomenal rate before the war to this more pedestrian rate, it's really a great rate in historical perspective. And I really do think clarity is in Canada. I don't think there's enough cross-comparison research done, generally speaking, between Canada and the United States when Canada provides a lot of those comparisons. And I know I'm biased. I'm from Michigan. But that bias from being a Michigander is important. I don't think there's much of a difference between a person from Sarnia and the FUM of Michigan. They're both rural agricultural areas. My in-laws have the same accent from the FUM as you do around Sarnia. And those institutions go beyond just cultural. They also go into potential studies in manufacturing policy. Imagine you're an auto manufacturer, say in Detroit, and you say to yourself, well, wouldn't it be great to produce things that I could export cheaper than the United States because there's all these trade barriers? If only there was like a country which has lower tariffs to send things to the British Empire. And wouldn't it be great if we were just like across the river? So I could build my entire manufacturing facility right next to my world headquarters. That's Windsor. There are different time periods of overlap between war involvement between Canada and the United States. That is a potential source of trying to maybe tweak out some of these differences that are taking place. They're building the same automobiles, generally speaking, in Windsor that they're building in Detroit. They're just building different plants to get around tariffs. And there are other industries that are going to be similar in relations, especially along that border. And that's an opportunity, again, to try to figure out what's happening in the short-term changes, the transitions to that war production, to inefficiencies, but then also to see, do we see the same total factor productive TFP story in Canada that we see in the United States? If we don't, we have to ask why. And if we do, is the timeline the same? If the timeline's different, then that's the opportunity to start seeing what are the things driving this. Because again, the big count of TFP is it's a residual. There's so many things TFP can be that it's tough to point to one thing that is driving the results. All right, so I'm going to hand it back to the speakers now. If you have questions of the general audience, please post your questions in YouTube, or you can tweet them using the hashtag tag OEHW2022.
Casey, why don't you go ahead, since that was the order in which Aaron presented comments. I have some responses then.
Yeah, okay, sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Those some really interesting comments, and I took down a lot of notes here. I think a lot of cool ideas. So the first thing you mentioned about about potentially the goalpost pushing, right, is it seems to be that maybe things weren't too prosperous during the war, but looking at the data, whether the series is adjusted or not, it's clear. We're at least in the Canadian context, we're out of the Great Depression. Say if we just focus on World War II for now, we're out of the Great Depression by the end of the war, right? And so, even if it's not the beginning of the war that ended the Depression, which I think some textbooks and things still say, perhaps there was something going on with that wartime spending that got us out. Now, this is sort of Vincent and I's first pass into this research, and so sort of as a first paper, our sort of idea was just to look at that sort of initial idea that it was the beginning of the war that ended the Depression. I think it could be really interesting as for some future work to maybe try and replicate some of Professor Field's ideas of looking at TFP through this time. And I particularly took a lot of notes at the end there, the fact that you have manufacturing just on the other side of the river, but that wartime mobilization, presumably starting at different times, could be an interesting sort of natural experiment to exploit. But I think, yeah, that's something we're going to have to look into in the future, definitely, because right now, as it stands, we don't really say anything about whether or not, down the road, even though the war, things maybe aren't prosperous during the war, that they're not leading to future prosperity. And so that's something we're going to have to tackle as we go forward with this. And you're right too, part of the issue of looking at a ratio in terms of the investment is that it can fall from changes in the numerator or the denominator. The one thing I will note is that the ratio falls through the mid part of World War II, even when divided by our adjusted series. So a series where you actually have the the denominator falling, right? So GDP is actually falling, and yet so is the ratio, right? So investment is falling even faster than the non-war GDP, which I think speaks to that concern a little bit. Also in the paper, we try and extract trends of investment. I didn't have it up on a slide today, but in the looking at trends, and you see that investment in real terms, not in ratios, in real terms is actually below trend during both wars. But yeah, I think that's something we can try and get a little more clear on as well. So yeah, I appreciate the comments a lot.
Should I go ahead, Aaron, then? Yeah, just a couple of comments on the Canadian situation. I mean, I think again, I'm not so concerned with the whole Higgs question about the welfare consequences during the war. I mean, I do think my recollection is that although there was a negative output gap in Canada, it may well have been substantially larger in the U.S., so that the closing of the output gap could have compensated for some of the mechanisms. Obviously, in terms of choosing the deflators during the war, it's a big problem. I mean, the price of a lot of goods, like a new automobile, is infinite. I mean, unless there's a 500,000 left from the 42, but basically there's some stuff that just isn't available. So, how exactly did you do with this? On the other hand, obviously the household balance sheets did come out of the war, I imagine, in both countries in much better shape than they were before the war. So, you have people, in terms of the welfare implications, you have people being compensated after the war, to surprise people. People can go out and, buy themselves, get a new car and deal with some of the deferred consumer durables from the Second World War. But again, that's not my major focus. Now, to the points that that Aaron was making, let me just share the screen again, if I may. Hold on. Just a second. I want to, whoops. Okay, so I guess there's a number of, Aaron kind of, questioned a certain variety of different issues about what I'm trying to set forth, and I have a number of theses, obviously, and so on. But, look, in terms of total factor productivity estimates, my basic philosophy on this is, to the extent possible, keep it simple. In other words, do not, just kind of make estimates for output growth, labor input growth, and capital services flow, and then discuss sensitivity to them, but don't kind of make an enormous number of adjustments to these series, because when you come out of it, there's so many moving parts, you can't figure out what's going on. So again, in terms of the basic empirical work here, I guess what I would say, again, the point is to soften people up. It's not necessarily supposed to be dispositive, but basically what I'm saying, look, if we do the best we can in terms of measuring outputs and inputs, the basic story between 41 and 48, and even more so between 41 and 45, is that inputs grew faster than output. The U.S. was enormously successful in producing a great deal of output and so on, but it did that the way it fought the war, and that was by throwing an enormous amount of inputs at the problem. And as a consequence, I'm arguing that in terms of what we mean by output per unit of input, it largely went down. So I guess in terms of the pushback, I'm saying, this is, of course, a provocative argument that manufacturing productivity went down. I don't dispute that the learning by doing ultimately led to some recovery, but I'm saying it's not enough to compensate for all of these adverse shocks associated with the product mix change and all of the other factors that I describe in terms of a wartime economy. I also, my strategy here is basically to lay out these numbers as clearly as I can in a replicable fashion. And of course, I did not have a chance to go into the very difficult and challenging problems in terms of measuring capital input, but I believe I make a persuasive case that if anything, capital service flow is underestimated. And I get into here the distinction between age efficiency profiles and age wealth profiles. And basically the argument which the BLS essentially adopts, the BEA isn't thrilled with it, is that service flow from durables declines much more slowly than does wealth. And so when we're forced to use wealth stocks as proxies for service flow, we generally tend to underestimate the growth of service flow, particularly when equipment is rising as a share in the capital stock and when the stock overall is getting younger. So if you're interested, I mean, this is discussed in the book and in the paper, you can get into that. So that's my basic kind of pushback in terms of Aaron's point. Let's okay. Let's discuss the sensitivity. Do you think these numbers are basically wrong? Now, the other point.
So Alex, I want to add a change there.
Sure.
I want to make sure you're clear. You successfully softened me up. So the reason why you see me with these follow-up questions is you so successfully softened me up. I'm now jumping to the next question. So
Sure.
I do want to make sure you understood that. You succeeded in softening me up. Now I'm like, why? What's going on that's creating these long-term outcomes? I mean, I'm almost starting to suspect I have to look more carefully at Austrian macro thought, because for them, these sort of interference in the markets creating long-term problems like this is a hallmark of their macro thinking. Not something I thought I'd have to do after looking at the paper at the moment.
I think the second question, of course, has to do with the long-term impact, and that's also part of what's being argued here. And again, I mean, I think I'm starting from a point where my kind of prior views of the Second World War and its long-term effect were just overwhelming influenced by Arrow and Alchian and just the enormous number of empirical studies of learning by doing. So that's kind of where the pushback is coming from, because people then, people start out being very detailed, very quantitative oriented, and then, just swimming in these, good feelings about victory and so on. There's these broad claims, and of course that laid the foundation for post-war prosperity, and that's what I'm pushing back on, and I'm doing it just point blank. It's not just productivity, it's an argument about what is the effect of the war on potential output in the post-war period, and I just try to go through it systematically. I mean, number one, look, 407,000, mostly prime-age males, never came back. Number two, the increase in female labor force participation was essentially a flash in the pan. It took another decade for it to come back up. As far as the learning that took place during the war, it was largely product specific, and almost all of those goods, all of those propeller-driven planes, we stopped producing them in 1945. And again, the story might be different if the U.S. essentially in the post-war years produced 100,000 aircraft every year, but we didn't. The production runs were much smaller, much more expensive per unit. So the product-specific knowledge essentially has to be written off. The value of these plants, many of them were special purpose. That's why they were sold for pennies on the dollar, often to the private sector. They were also very, very specialized. As far as the machine tools, again, the U.S. system of production involves largely, except for in the firms that are making machine tools, it involves special purpose, single purpose machine tools. And when you change products, you basically have to rip out and throw away all the jigs, the frames, and the machine tools and get new ones. So all of that has to be junked. As far as the military capital accumulation, you see these pictures of the boneyards in Arizona. Some of these planes were flown directly from the factory to Arizona for deconstruction, essentially ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You see they have on-site smelters there and aluminum ingots in front of them. So I think if you go through this systematically in terms of the effects on the labor force, effects on capital, and effects on productivity, you essentially begin to view the war as a detour from a situation existing in 1941 where, as the work of Steve Broadbury and others has shown, the U.S. had accumulated a very substantial productivity advantage over the rest of the world. The 30 years after the Second World War, Abramovitz talked about this, is when Europe and Japan essentially closed that output gap. It's a big part of their very strong product and productivity performance. But I think I'm basically arguing, and I'll stop here, is to say that I believe that these two bodies of evidence, and there's just, the quotes are just some of the quotes are just just unbelievable in terms of what you find out here, describing the chaos and lack of planning. You can read the paper. I guess one other thing would be nice to have the papers posted and both papers posted and available. I didn't see that was done for people who might be interested in the presentation. Aaron, if you could, maybe that could be done as well. But I don't see the either type of evidence in these two bodies necessarily as by themselves being dispositive. I think at one point in the book, actually, I say, my discussion of TFP is directed at two audiences: those who really kind of are very skeptical about TFP and those who are not. I think both audiences, need to look at this very closely. But I think together, at least what I'm trying to do is to make a compelling, what I hope is provocative case for us to re-examine our thinking about the supply side consequences of the war.
One question we have for Alex is it possible to disaggregate the manufacturing figures that you have for particular industries to consider which industries were the leaders in productivity or productivity enhancement, or which ones were the laggards in the 30s or in the 40s, to see what?
I think you can get value added, by individual industries. You may be able to get FTEs by individual industries. I'm not sure that you can get the kind of capital numbers that you need to do this, by the individual sectoral industry. So I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of disaggregation, there's nothing in the paper about this, but in the book, I do look at other sectors of the economy. Now, this was a question about within manufacturing. And one of my arguments is you can do some crude stuff. For example, the rubber industry, the whole building of the synthetic rubber industry is something that I devote considerable attention to. I knew very, very little about this before I got into this. So you can look at, for example, the quantity of rubber that's natural rubber and synthetic that's being processed, and divide that by the total employment in the industry. I do have some data on that and so on. So you get some rough evidence on labor productivity in that sector. But it's an interesting question. I don't know how far that can be pushed empirically. But again, I am not disputing. I want to be very clear about this. I'm not trying to kind of blow off, all of the very impressive work that's been done and continues to be done on learning by doing and the learning curves and all of that prediction. I'm simply trying to pull back the camera and put it in a larger context and saying, we focus so much. It's not hard to get a very high rate of productivity growth if you start from zero. That's I think most of us understand that. And in fact, when you have the annual model product changeover, or when Ford switched over from making Model Ts to Model As in 1927, output drops to zero. Productivity drops to zero for a number of months. That's kind of a standard dynamic. So we focus so much on the recovery from that, and just to the degree that the depression and the continual chaotic situations in the manufacturing sector because of rationing and because of the continuing changes in product mix, I think we've lost sight of that.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Casey, for sharing your papers with us today. On behalf of myself and the organizers of the online economic history workshop, I want to thank you for sharing your work, and for those of you in the audience for participating with us today, taking the time to join us and to share your insightful questions. We have two other events scheduled this week, one on Wednesday and one on Friday, both at noon Eastern time. Our next panel is on the rallying resources for war, and the one for Friday is on civilian responses to war. Both panels will be broadcast live on YouTube. To learn more or to sign up for email notifications for future workshops, please go to www.oehw.org. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Casey.